Welcome back. Our next session is a panel session, Beyond Fake News. Are we suffering from an information disorder? Our panellists are Dr. Timothy Graham, Professor Colin Klein and Tom Sear, and discussion will be facilitated by Dr. Kate Davis. Dr. Timothy Graham is a senior lecturer in digital media at the Queensland University of Technology. His research combines computational methods with social theory to study online networks and platforms, with a particular interest in online bots and trolls, disinformation, and online ratings and rankings devices. You can find Tom on Twitter at Timothy J. Graham. Professor Colin Klein is an academic at the School of Philosophy at the Australian National University. He works on philosophy of psychology and has a special interest in the psychology and epistemology of online conspiracy theorising. You can find Colin on Twitter as at CV Klein. Tom Sear is an industry fellow and PhD candidate in cybersecurity at UNSW Canberra Cyber at the Australian Defence Force Academy. He has advised parliaments and industry on social media manipulation, counterintelligence initiatives, Internet of Things, and 5G policy. His research concerns how to build resilient national computational cultures to defend against active measures, manipulation, and cyberstorm. You can find Tom on Twitter as at Tom Sear. Facilitating the panel discussion is Dr. Kate Davis. Kate is the Principal Lead, Digital Pedagogy and Curriculum at the University of Southern Queensland. She is an information researcher who researches at the nexus of information, technology and learning, and you can find Kate on Twitter as at Katie Davis. Over to you.
Thanks, Monica. Good afternoon, everyone, and thanks for joining us for what I'm anticipating will be a dynamic discussion on the concept of information disorder. My name's Kate and I'm a member of the Program Committee for Information Online, and as Monica said, I'm an information researcher with a particular interest in how people experience information in online spaces. I'll be facilitating the panel session today. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work, the Yugambeh people. I acknowledge their elders past, present and emerging, and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and community. Our topic for this session really taps into the zeitgeist. We have just come out of an extraordinary year, one that provided plenty of fodder to fuel the information sector's collective interest in fake news and a post-truth world. As an information researcher, I've watched with fascination how people have engaged around topics from climate change early last year to COVID-19 to the rollout of 5G and on to the US presidential election. I've also been closely watching the work of media studies researchers, some of whom we have on our panel today, as they've explored the concept of information disorder. This afternoon, we've brought together these researchers and commentators from outside the library world to explore the concept of information disorder and particularly why this concept is garnering attention at this particular moment in time. We'll start out the panel session with a brief presentation from each of our panelists. Then we'll move on to explore some questions, including an open Q&A. Please feel free to pop your questions in the Ask a Question section throughout the session so that we can collate them. Just remembering that we're a couple of minutes ahead of you in our presenting, so just have those questions at the ready. Just a reminder, if you're tweeting about the session, the conference hashtag is InfoOnline21. We've also shared the panelists' Twitter handles in the chat, and I've shared them on Twitter as well if you'd like to connect with them there. So, Tim, would you like to get us started?
Sorry, I was muted. I would love to. So thank you so much, Kate and Monica, for the introduction and for the invitation to participate in this session. Yeah, so my name is Tim Graham. I'm a lecturer in digital media, and over the past 5 or more years, I've been very interested in trying to understand the role that different actors play in shaping our behavior on social media. And I think going into this session, it gave me the opportunity to reflect on, well, what do we actually mean by, information disorder? And what to me is the biggest, what are the big issues that we're facing at the moment? I think that So information disorder is this concept that was introduced by Claire Wardle to kind of provide a conceptual basis to categorize the different kinds of false information that circulate in our online spaces. So we've got misinformation, and I guess we could return to the definitions, but we've got, very briefly, we've got misinformation, which is false information spread unwittingly. We have disinformation, which is false information, spread with the intent to deceive, or with the intent to gain some strategic advantage. And then malinformation, which is genuine information that's spread in a way to cause harm or to damage. So we've got this mis, and disinformation that have been conceptualized as information disorder. And amongst all of this, we've seen, I really still can't get a handle on just the deluge, or the infodemic that we've had of information disorder in the advent of COVID-19. But in Australia before that, we had the bushfires, and just a deluge of false information that was floating around, that people were engaging with, that different kinds of actors, some who held different amounts of power, were spreading. And I think the last year, to your point, Kate, before, about why we're studying this and why we're focusing on it, I think the last year has really brought home for every country the way in which the health of our online media ecosystems really matters, and what kind of effects this can have, both in terms of the health of populations, for our environment, for our future, and for the quality of the information that we get. But I guess I thought it would be useful just to kind of provide a general introduction here. But for me, in my research, what I've found to be the most concerning and the most difficult problem to apprehend is this growing problem of domestic disinformation. And I think that this is something that's really come to light. Even in the last couple of months, I've noticed a bit of a sea change in the Australian context, but in the US as well, when we're suddenly trying to make sense of, well, why is it the case that politicians, that members of parliament, that mainstream media agencies that we would otherwise depend on, or we would sort of think of as these conveyors of quality information, why do they seem to be at the center of controversies around what they're saying and what effect this has? And I guess just briefly, this brings me to, I think, what are some of the fundamental questions that are facing democracies and facing lawmakers and facing information researchers and everyone really, journalists as well, about, well, what are we going to do now, where we've suddenly realized that major issues around access to adequate health information, protecting our elections so that there can be free and fair processes and things like that. What do we do now when the monster is not outside the house trying to, that actually the call, so to speak, is coming from inside the house? The twist all along is that bots and trolls, foreign interference, they are big issues. Yes, there's no doubt about that. But I would argue, and I'll just put this out there and then close my bit here, I would argue that these actors, they have a vanishingly small impact on information disorder compared to the elites in the public sphere, politicians, journalists, and the like. And so I guess, I'll wrap up now because I'm conscious of time, but I think that to me is one of the most profound and I think urgent or critical tasks that we need to address, I think, moving forward as we go into yet another year of information disorder.
Thanks very much, Tim. Tom, it's over to you.
Yeah, so I work in kind of the space of defending cyber systems, as well as analysing information interference or disinformation interference from often nation-state actors, including the infamous example of the Russian Internet Research Agency, sort of some relatively big data capture around Chinese social media and its impact in Australia, but also in, as I mentioned, in kind of what we might call hard cyber, like defending cyber systems and hack and leak operations. So I'm sort of keen to sort of hack this idea of order and disorder here, and try and put it into sort of a bigger picture, if you like, where we think about the question of like natural systems and questions of time, and time in the sense of it being both history and the ontological question of time. So the sort of ontological and metaphysical questions about what information really is, and what is information really. And when we look at how these systems tend to behave, they look quite a lot like fluid dynamics, actually. So like chaos systems, so like storms and that sort of type of system. So what does it mean that what we do on social media might have a similar correlation to that? Also, I guess in upper hominids societies, deception is a feature, not a bug. So, I mean, it's chimpanzees are known to like hide a bunch of bananas if they think the rest of the mob haven't seen this bunch of bananas. So, and human society functions around deception, lies, disinformation constantly. We couldn't operate without it. If you were honest about my haircut, then you know who knows how things would go. But it's contextual as well, because if my partner says your haircut looks rubbish, then that's useful information. But if we do it socially, it's different. So it's always in context as well. So we need to look at data, but we need to think about when is measurement useful, I suppose, as well. But it's like, why, as you mentioned earlier, why is it happening now? And I think it's partly because we've moved from a politics of space to a politics that's about time. So famous Rulio quote, like a society moves as fast as its weapon system, which we use in the military a bit. And what is it now? It's cyber warfare, which is the speed of light, effectively. And it's happening at planetary scale. So we've got this mega structure called the internet that we just sort of invented and suddenly came into being. And that's kind of associated with a politics of time, which is about, in some cases, an eternal presence, whereby we're habitually tied into a system that is highly turbulent and really about the present. Really isn't about the past or the future in any way. There's this eternal present. But there's also this paradox where, so you have the president in an 18th century house with an 18th century constitution using Twitter to contact the entire world. So then the question is, in that situation, what is what we would call it influence, I suppose, in a military setting? And it's not always what you think, I suppose. It's not even about facts even. So, for example, the Australian Open's on at the moment. When I went and examined the Russian Internet Research Agency's function in Australia, it did seem to target the Australian Open every year. That's because there's a politics of the spectacular in Russia, and they did sort of cyber attack WADA and a whole lot of organisations like that. So it means that if you want to go after Australians, you would go after sport if you wanted to influence them in politics, for example. So what does all that mean, I suppose? So I guess I'm encouraging to think about where are the asymmetries? And the asymmetries are in data, not necessarily in how we think about what information is as fact or non-fact. So that polarity is weaponized generally, and we're seeing that frame restructured rather than necessarily broken down. So we're in a kind of an era when is it a problem of information disorder, or is it a problem of disintegration? And then is it a challenge about, is there a real problem about who owns the data and why we have data asymmetries in that data? That's what I think about. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Tom. So we're going to turn our attention slightly away from the media sphere and the technology aspect for a moment. And Colin is going to talk to us about conspiracy theories.
Yeah, sure. Great. Thanks. And hopefully everyone can see the slides. So my work is mostly on conspiracy theorists rather than information, but I think it's a kind of general story about you can take away about misinformation. So here's something that kind of sums up, I think, recent years. We've got a sketchy claim about Rothschild space lasers that come from a sketchy website being passed around on Facebook by someone who's now a US representative. I think, as Tim pointed out, the role of politically powerful actors in this can't be denied. So this seems like, look, it's kind of weird. You might wonder, how does anyone believe this, much less pass it on? That's been a lot of my research. And there are two assumptions that I want to bring up to question and then kind of give a more nuanced picture. So the first that I think is very common in presentations is that conspiracy theorists have what's called a monological belief systems. This is a great phrase by Goertzel in the 90s. And the idea is that the archetypal conspiracy theorist is someone for whom everything connects to everything else. So if you're old enough to like Fox Mulder, he's like this. On the right is a contemporary QAnon version where the CIA and Israel and pharmaceutical companies and probably literally everything you could think of is on the chart somewhere. But now there's a bit of a selection bias in this, in that the conspiracy theorists you're likely to encounter often have a quite aggressive belief system like this. But when we look at Reddit, so a lot of my work is done on Reddit, suggests that there's actually more of a gradient here. So you get everything from people who are concerned with really just a single issue, like old style anti-vaxxers, all the way up through someone like, QAnon believers. QAnon is now quite, so super well connected. And then in between, you've got, for example, quite your classic racist conspiracy theories about Jewish cabals. They're mainly there, they've got a single focus, but it's not that everything connects to that, just kind of everything you can make fit. And there are more specific themes like concerns about US foreign policy, concerns about medical experimentation, and so on. So there is possibly some movement around on this, but I think a lot of people just stick to one spot. So there's a lot more diversity online than you'd think. Another assumption, I think this is worth keeping in mind, is this idea that when people assert conspiracy theories online, they're kind of sincere expressions of what they believe. Now, sometimes that's true. Like these people, whatever they believe about QAnon, it was enough to do kind of incredibly stupid things. There was a guy on Reddit who wrote like 900,000 words on conspiracy theories. That's like 2 Lord of the Rings trilogies if you're into books. But this is like, so those people really believe what they say. But there are a lot of reasons to say something that's not just to express a sincere belief. So you might be, in many cases, questioning, you might have some concern about what's going on, and you might express a conspiracy theory as a way to express that. You might also be wrapped up, this is one of my favorite graphs from an academic paper or charts, it might be wrapped up with this kind of self-narrative. So a lot of anti-vax sentiment, for example, is wrapped up with someone's self-image as like a good mom or a questioning mom. You get these kinds of self-narratives a lot, and really expressing conspiracy theories is part of that. There are also just straight up trolls online. I think people tend to underestimate how much of conspiracy theorizing is just people making things up and seeing if it sticks. So you get a gradient there too, let's call it a gradient, and then you can get a kind of more multi-dimensional taxonomy. So yeah, this is not the data-driven part, I made this up this morning, but very roughly you can get things like, fully monological beliefs that range from sincere to trolling. You can get kind of shifts from classic anti-vaxxers who tended to be fairly single issues to modern, like 2021 anti-vaxxers, where it tends to spread out. But I think the interesting thing about the online case is you have a range of attitudes and a range of kind of topics, but everyone online is interacting with everyone else. So you've got people who are just trolling, mixing it up with people who are quite, sincere about what they believe. And that creates very complicated dynamics online, even around this very same bit of information. So I think there's a lot to talk about there. I think, I'm looking forward to the discussion. I always have to thank Australian Research Council for keeping the lights on. So thanks.
Thanks very much, Colin. So I guess my first question kind of picks up from where you left off, Colin, and that is, I think we've all probably looked at the weird and far-fetched theories like the idea that 5G is linked to coronavirus and wondered how people could possibly believe these ridiculous things. And you've talked about the fact that people don't necessarily have to believe something in order to share that information online. But some people do believe what they're posting. I mean, I can no longer look at the comments on Anastasia Palaszczuk's Instagram post because it just makes my brain explode. But are people irrational for believing in conspiracy theories and misinformation, or is this reasonable extensions of ordinary epistemic processes?
Yeah, so I think that's a really good question. I always want to preface what I'm about to say by saying that most conspiracy theories are wrong and actually quite dangerous and harmful to believe. So this is not meant to be an excusing story. But in many cases, I think what you do find is that people start getting into conspiracy theories by finding something that's got, it's not a germ of truth, a kind of historical antecedent. So an example I like to use, there's a lot of talk about right-wing misinformation about vaccines, but one of the sort of largest vaccine hesitant communities in the US is African Americans. And the reason for that is a very long history of medical experimentation on African Americans, much of it unethical. And that's created a lot of conspiracy theories. Now, many of those are false. So there's a kind of classic AIDS was created to kill Black people conspiracy theory. That's pretty sure that's not true. But if you go back and you look back at where that's coming from, a lot of that is reactions to things like the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which did happen. So even if these are irrational, I think a lot of times what happens is people get into this, and then there's a kind of bad process where you start questioning accurate sources of information a little too aggressively, and it becomes very hard to pull yourself back. But I think the things that people are doing, kind of looking at past antecedents, trying to figure out who to trust, that's something we all have to do. And I think that's one of the things that makes online misinformation so insidious. So it's not just kind of silly people believing silly things. It's often reasonable people trying and failing, but doing the things that we all have to do.
So right now, viral spread is on all of our minds. And it might be tempting to think about the spread of misinformation as a modern day epidemic. Do you think that's true, Colin? Or should we think of the spread of misinformation as like an epidemic, or do people actively seek this stuff out?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question. It's an interesting metaphor. So on the one hand, it is troubling people get exposed. We talk about exposure and people and spread and that sort of thing. On the other hand, there is a sense, and certainly online, that people do go looking for more information. They do go looking for information either to confirm their beliefs or just because they're interested. So we did some work on Reddit trying to figure out where people were posting before they posted in the conspiracy forums, including people that were there for a long time. And you find that in many cases, these are people who already have kind of idiosyncratic or otherwise counterculture beliefs. So some of them are coming through odd political forums. Some are coming from they're already interested in drugs and UFOs, and they're kind of going through and finding more stuff. So I think it's worth being a little cautious about the epidemic metaphor, because it kind of has this picture of people sort of passively online, completely passive online. But in fact, people do have quite a lot of agency online and make a number of decisions about what they look for. So I think there's a lovely quote by, I can't remember if it's by a social psychologist. It's something like, to say that a certain kind of bar provokes fights is one thing, but of course only a certain kind of person will go to that bar in the first place. And I think a lot of parts of the internet sort of work like that.
So let's just pick that up from a slightly different angle. Tom or Tim, what do you think about this from a kind of media studies perspective? I think, Tom, you've got your mic on, so we'll turn to you. So what can we add to what Colin said?
Yeah, I mean, following on from what Colin was suggesting there, I mean, I don't think that we can call it an infodemic, actually, because that really arises from WHO attempt to correlate two forms of ideas, which is the epidemic and information. But information really doesn't really transmit that way, but it is a useful heuristic for people, and that's kind of where we're talking about here. So you only typically, if you were running a nation-state interference campaign, you would, as Colin suggests, take one core fact, usually historical, and then just reframe that constantly through the present and get it to amplify what people might actually already feel. So that's really how things do, especially conspiracy theory. So I think we call it an infodemic. We might consider, say, conspiracy theories maybe a public health problem if we think about it that way, and maybe think about it, unwilling people are affected, like we all get sick. Then why wouldn't you have, if someone had an information illness, then why wouldn't you help them? So I think we could think about it that way. But do filter bubbles exist? That's one of the questions we have, and it's a debate in the academic community. So yeah.
Great, thanks. Tim, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about what makes people believe what they see on social media. What are the design features and the architectures of social media platforms that afford this information disorder?
Yeah, good question. I'd like to go back to Colin's bar metaphor here to answer this question. I think that increasingly, what we're finding is that the notion of motivated reasoning has a very strong explanatory power for understanding the motivations, or how do people come to believe and incorporate into their own value systems, into their own identities, into their own systems of knowledge making. How does that play out? And I think that having a predilection for getting into a scuff in a bar, or having watched YouTube videos where people are having scuffs in bars. I mean, this is a simplistic kind of take on it, but I think that to your question about what makes people believe what they see, often their identity, the sense of group that they belong to, the strength of their convictions about who they think is the other, who they think the enemy is. I think those three things sort of go a long way as far as I can see. And I think that this perhaps plays out in an even more magnified way in spaces like Reddit that Colin mentioned before, just because of the design of those platforms and how they differ from mainstream media. And then to the second flip side of your question about design features and architecture, I think really what we have to really acknowledge and appraise, especially in our legal and regulatory response to information disorder, is that these platforms, in large part, were designed to solve the problem of how to get as much content out as quickly as possible to people. They are in there, the very nuts and bolts, the very engines of these things are designed to solve the scale and the speed problem. But what they didn't solve was the quality problem. And so I guess what I just would highlight quickly is that the design features and the architecture, the way that these platforms are built, affords certain kinds of information and certain kinds of content to pass very quickly and to be taken up by people, and distributed at great speed. But and they're optimized for that, but they're not optimized for quality. So what you don't see turning up in your news feed is a slow burning, long, boring scientific paper about the efficacies that are mixed about some particular response or whatever the case might be. What you get, is a silver bullet hot take, and you can't help but click that retweet button. So I think that the history, and it's a very short history, but long by internet terms, that the history of these platforms is that they were designed to optimize and solve two problems at the expense of another one: speed and scale at the expense of quality. And unfortunately, we're seeing it all fall apart now.
Get you to keep your microphone on, Tim, because I'm going to ask you a follow-up question. You mentioned earlier the concept of domestic disinformation, and Tom's talked about his work around international actors in this kind of disinformation space. But can you explain what domestic disinformation is, and just tell us a little bit about its scale and impact in Australia? Yeah,
great question. So, I mean, when we think about information disorder, I guess the examples that often come to mind is foreign interference. So before Tom mentioned the Internet Research Agency, and these kinds of monsters, these entities are at the forefronts of our minds in popular culture and in the news. We also, to pick up on Colin's point before, we think about just trolls and the technical term is shit posters who do it for other reasons. And it's not often clear. But I think what we've really come to understand, especially in towards the end of last year during the US, presidential election, just how much of this is actually coming from inside, the territories of nations, and who is actually responsible for doing this, and how big of an effect do they have compared to these monsters who are, kind of roaming outside at night. So, I mean, domestic disinformation turns attention towards, essentially domestic actors, politicians, those who are elected by the polity, mainstream media that are focused on national issues. And I guess very briefly, maybe the most prevalent case study is election fraud in the US. So, seeing a sitting president denying the empirical reality about votes as they are coming in, and weaponizing not only social media, but also the law, using the judicial system in a strategic way, spreading false information with malicious purposes. This is disinformation. So it's domestic disinformation. It's coming from the president. It's coming from a party. I'm not saying that the Republican Party are the only, there's plenty of examples, but it's this kind of, this mode, if you like, of disinformation, where it's not some other monster that's from another country or sitting in the basement, somewhere, tweeting this puerile stuff. It's actually, it's right in front of our faces. And I think that this in many ways, well, I just make the argument, and I think this is orders of magnitude worse in terms of the effect that it has on the health of our information ecologies and the health of our democracies. Domestic disinformation, not foreign interference, I think it's one of the most critical issues that we have to face.
Thanks. And Tom, you've written about how fake news is warping Australian democracy. Is there anything you'd like to add to this discussion?
Yes, well, I mean, to my mind, fake news is itself fake news. I'd like to emphasise the point that it's about kind of distorting, like most disinformation or misinformation is about distortion of the frame rather than something which is fake or non-factual. And I guess following on from where Tim's going, I'd sort of question, where is the outside really in a sovereign state anymore? Really, we operate in sort of multiple stacks, really, which are, we're sort of an Anglo-American, probably Israel's in our stack. There's clearly a Chinese stack. There's sort of a semi-European stack, and Russia are trying to develop their own stack. So these are sort of internets which we operate in, less so than national sovereign entities. And what Tim's describing there is actually, they're all the techniques that you had historically used in the espionage for communities. So, and you do see it in the present now. So, I mean, like the IRA, which is the Internet Research Agency, they were sort of tweeting about vaccination in about 2013. I remember noticing in Facebook certain groups in Australia, which seemed a bit strange, sort of around 2015, 2016, which are anti-vaxxers. And so it's where is amplification and where is internal and where is external anymore? And the way that the Russians have responded is actually to place fake entities in other countries. In Africa, I've seen some in Australia that function as Australians. So they don't actually focus on the United States anymore. To focus on the United States, you focus on Australia. And so the tactics are constantly changing. The tactics that people do use now do seem to be reflective of earlier espionage techniques. But again, they're constantly changing. Really, we need to think about how change functions. As Tim sort of referenced there, about how change functions in the internet. If we're going to really get a handle on what is going on, rather than trying to sort of nail jelly to the wall sort of stuff.
Thanks. So I'm wondering about what it is that's distinctive about the misinformation we've seen in the past year or two. So Colin, let's start with you. Why in particular have conspiracy theorists become obsessed with, say, pedophilia and child trafficking?
I think that's a really good question. I wish I had a better answer. It's a really striking thing, even since I've started working on online conspiracy theories in the past 4 or 5 years or so. It's come to dominate the narrative. I think some of it is historically contingent. So I think Tim and I probably like the same book quite a bit. So there was a lot of misinformation that was around demonizing Hillary Clinton in particular. And this picked up on existing narratives, and particularly the Pizzagate, which I believe really kind of started as a trolling exercise, but, you know, had Hillary Clinton as child trafficking, and that really picked it up, picked up and ran with it. There's also this, you know, Tim mentioned these ideas about how these things play into identity and concepts of identity. And I think there's something about child trafficking where everyone thinks, well, look, this would be bad if it were true. What's the harm in passing it on? So, you know, you get these, and I think in the old days, you used to also get kind of rumors like this, or it might be called more like urban legends. But so now it takes on an even more sinister tack. So it's a kind of narratively, it's a very striking and appealing sort of thing. But it's, I'm really unsure. There's something deeper going on about feelings of so if you're feeling vulnerable and you're feeling manipulated by the powers that be, there's something about child trafficking that's the kind of apotheosis of vulnerability and exploitation. So I think there are a lot of things going on there, but it's really kind of taken hold in essentially everything. Oh, and I'll say one more thing. Jeffrey Epstein, like the conspiracy theorists were kind of on Jeffrey Epstein for early on. Epstein's rearrest and suicide like really threw a lot of fuel on that fire. So just to go back to the point I made before, the idea that powerful billionaires sometimes exploit women is true. And like we have evidence for that. And that, so, you know, that gives you the kind of seed around which a lot of the more outlandish conspiracy theories grow. But it has become, I think, really such a core part of the narrative that it's really, you know, it's really striking to me. I don't know if you guys, Tim, Tom, have seen similar things around this. But I think mainly that, and then again, the willingness of, I want to echo Tim's point again, the willingness of, you know, politically connected people, even within the institution for their own domestic reasons to spread and amplify these kinds of narratives certainly doesn't help at all, right? So, you know, that's also really helped it take off.
So one of the things that came through in the chat as a question was, is there something about gaining power or feeling empowered by accepting and promoting misinformation and conspiracy theories?
I mean, I can say, I mean, other people can feel free to jump in. It's an interesting problem because on the one hand, right, thinking that the world, you know, the world is run by an elite of billionaire pedophile sex traffickers, like that makes the world even more scary. So it's not like it gives you individual power. What it does do is give some kind of like narrative or explanatory resolution. So I think a lot of the misinformation around COVID, right, the true story, like probably someone in China eats a bat and now we have to stay indoors for a year. Like that's a terrible story. That's boring. It's got no oomph. It's got no pull to it. Whereas like secret bioweapons labs and escapes and like Hollywood movie plots, even if that feels in some sense more sinister and even worse, at least you can get a handle on it. At least you've got some kind of sort of epistemic power over it, even if it makes your actual world much darker and more sinister.
Tim or Tom, did you want to add anything before I jump in?
I mean, yeah, it's, just picking up on Colin's comments. I mean, I'm scratching my head often trying to figure out and piece together how, you know, how this all works. But something that I've noticed over the last year has been just how social mis and disinformation can be. And, you know, when I go and analyze data sets in the Australian Twitter sphere, for example, I'm always seeing, until they get suspended, many of them, but, you know, up until that point, I keep seeing these, you know, accounts keep coming back. And it's like watching an episode of Neighbours, or, you know, watching a show like Neighbours or Home and Away. You know, it's like, here they are, and I know them so well. And yes, they might have been, you know, to pick up on what Colin was saying before, they might have been spreading, you know, conspiracy theories that the coronavirus was a bioweapon engineered by, you know, by China. Yes, but at the same time, they're sort of saying, hey, you know, I'm here for you. And if your account gets suspended, it's because the media is trying to dominate us, and there's and this is more evidence. And don't worry, you know, just start up a new account. We'll all follow you. And they're all holding hands. And there's this real, you know, kind of sense of kind of camaraderie. And then you map the follower networks and you're like, huh, you know, how dense are these? Because they're all following each other. They're all supporting each other. And it's such, I think the takeaway for me, and it's a bit tentative at this point, is that it does, mis and disinformation you know, it does have this kind of participatory culture element to it. It's a very strong social validation logic to it, and social participation. And I think that during a pandemic, when you're isolated at home and, you know, people are wrestling with mental health issues and things like that in their houses, and they're struggling to make sense of things, and they have on offer these really simplistic frameworks, like Colin said before, versus trying to actually appraise the complexity of things. Well, there's other people out there, and yeah, it feels good. And I think that, I don't know, I think that does the social aspect does play a pretty big role, I think, potentially.
We actually had a question come through in the chat asking whether you think of the isolation caused by COVID has given some people a sense of belonging around these conspiracy theories. I guess that relates to what you're saying. So they form these communities and buoy each other up. Do you think there's something about belonging more generally there?
I mean, I certainly see this on Reddit, and I think Tim's absolutely right. This participatory storytelling is like old school role playing games or something. You're kind of, and that's again one of the things I was emphasizing. It's sometimes very hard to tell when people are sincerely asserting something as opposed to being kind of willing to play along, willing to kind of add to it just because it's fun. And again, I liked Tim's frame before, a lot of the talk about what the internet is optimized to do. And the other thing it's really optimized well for is getting people with similar interests to be in touch with each other and, you know, share and validate each other. So I've been doing a little bit of work on Twitter recently on Black Lives Matters, and there's like a whole really dense subcluster on trans people of color who are coming together over Black Lives Matters. And you think, like, that's probably good. They seem pretty sweet. That they're not spreading misinformation as far as I can tell. And like, that seems like one of the success stories of Twitter. And there's actually, in many cases, that's the kind of thing that the internet is really good at doing. And we notice it when it's promoting something, you know, misinformation or something unpalatable. But most of Reddit is actually like quite lovely and functional. I've come to really appreciate Reddit while working on it because there's some really great communities on there. So I think this is one of the things the internet does well, kind of independently of content. And that's something that's also worth keeping in mind.
We also have to question, like, we're all talking about individuals and societies and the social, but we don't really talk very much about the what I might call the vectors. To a certain extent, like Tim and Colin talking about their affordances. Like, what is the structure that's sort of framing the way in which people do relate? I mean, we sort of focus on human behaviour and look for explanation. I'd be sort of more interested in like how a vector and who owns that vector. And if we use an historical model, like say previously we had mass communications, so who had the control there of knowledge or power? The person that owned the mass comm model. But you don't really have to own anything anymore. You just have to have the vector that runs the algos, which gets everyone together to do the work. And that's how the system's kind of got hacked. So what does that really mean? One of the things that we don't know, we don't really have any benchmarks. We don't know how many people were feeling this and thinking this in 1970 or 1964 or 1982 or 1994. And we don't, because of the way in which the algos are structured, they're determined by specific graph theory, which formulates a certain position around the way humans relate and certain assumptions. And it's driving that model. And society doesn't really work, hasn't worked that way historically either. So we don't, like, how do we know there's more or less disinformation? How do we know people, maybe this has always been the way, but now we're just seeing and measuring it?
So I'd like to ask a question of Tim. What do you think, Tim, is the cost of information disorder?
This is a really tricky one. I'm glad it's one of the last, questions that were pushed towards the end, towards the latter part of the panel. I think that you can look at this from a number of perspectives, but I'd like to start with the human cost, which I think, in many ways is I think this is where our compass really should be tuned to when it comes to, trying to understand the impact of mis and disinformation. And again, just as an example, pointing towards, the election fraud, domestic disinformation that occurred during the 2020 election. I mean, people died when these conspiracy theorists stormed the Capitol. Innocent people died, you know, as well, and the cost continues. And I think even on the, well, especially on this basis, I think that we have to realize that this is not something, information disorder is not something that's consigned to the online world. You know, that this whole online offline thing has been has been disavowed in universities or in the kind of ivory tower of theorists for 20 years now. But it's still, I think there's still this kind of popular conception that what happens online stays online. You know, when people are on Twitter saying stuff, well, who cares? If something trends on Twitter, it doesn't matter. But it does. And I think that the cost of this is often as explicit as lives lost. And when you look at the history of mis and disinformation in election contexts, you see this. Look at 2014 in Myanmar. I mean, you know, in the elections there, you look at the role of social media in you know, human suffering and loss of life. It's terrible. But then, you know, look at coronavirus. I think that, you know, the cost of rampant health misinformation and maliciously spread false information, the cost here is that, you know, people may be sicker for longer than they should be. People don't get the health care that they need potentially, and then in some cases they'll die. So, I mean, we could look at economic costs, we could look at social costs, we can look at costs to information quality, and those are all, you know, really valid lenses onto this problem. But I think at this point, and I'm really just channeling, you know, the leading disinformation researchers in the world, you know, who like Joan Donovan, for example, who's been, you know, crying out about this for years now. There's a human cost here, and we really need to address this issue, because at the end of the day, it does matter, and it doesn't just stay online.
Yeah, it's quite sobering, really. And on that very sobering note, I guess I'd like us to kind of finish on heading on an upward trajectory. So it'd be great if you could each comment on what you think can be done to deal with our information disorder. And Colin, let's start with you. How do we combat the spread of conspiracy theories, or do we even need to, or is that our roles?
I think it's, so a lot of times I think it's worth treating conspiracy theorizing as much a symptom as a cause in itself. I mean, these things get complicated, but I do think part of the problem, and one thing that, you know, is politically tractable in some ways, is a general distrust of government and governmental institutions. So if you think in general that if bad things are going to happen, you'll find out about them sooner or later, then that's, I think, creates more confidence in the system and lowers belief in conspiracy theorizing. So I think there's been a drift, and this is true in Australia as well, certainly in the US, over the past decade or two, of, you know, weakening Freedom of Information Act laws, things like pushing business cases off onto private entities so that they don't have to be part of Freedom of Information Act laws. That kind of thing, to take an example there, you know, that I'm sure seems politically expedient at the time, but then you come back and now I say, well, look, I think that, I'm going to make something up. I'm sure it'll go, you know, the New South Wales government built WestConnex to like cover up a cabal of mole people. And you're like, well, you know, who knows? Like they hid so much else there. Like maybe there's a bunch of mole people down there. What do I know? That's the flip version. But I think actually there's a lot of stuff we can do institutionally. And I think it's worth pointing out, you know, as I do sometimes in conversation, a lot of the conspiracy theory, the kind of weird conspiracies that we know about that actually did happen, like all the crazy stuff the CIA did in the 60s, was largely uncovered by other institutions doing their kind of due diligence, holding hearings, releasing documents, that sort of thing. So I think, you know, in terms of like smaller scale stuff, but still really important, that increasing trust in the transparency of institutions is something worth working for.
Thanks. Tom, I'll get you to go next. And I'm wondering in particular, how do we deal with the challenge of to democracy that's posed by cyber manipulation?
Yeah, I'm probably going to harsh everyone's vibe a bit and say I really don't think we can do very much. digital literacy is spoken about a lot. And when you sit in front of a parliamentary committee to speak on this, it's often grabbed and spoken about. And obviously, talking to a community of knowledge workers who are interested in literacy and so on and so forth. But that works for a country like Finland, which is the classic case where there's a whole of society management around a particular problem. Australia has kind of an adversarial democratic system. And so if you wanted to hack our system, you would actually just create more adversarial conflict. And so that'll only get escalated through polarization around debate. And that's what trolls sort of work on. I'd probably try and think about what is the internet for? So like the ACCC at the moment has an interim report, it's 222 pages if you want to read it, which is about how advertising and micro-targeting functions. And that's what I've seen in the last year, and particularly in relation to the elections and some of the internal disinformation that Tim's talking about. It's all about micro-targeting, and it's all about getting you as a person and identifying who you are and what it means. And that's kind of what the British case was about around Brexit as well. So if the internet's about selling you things, what is the structure by which they do that, and what are your data rights really, and who owns your data? We're moving to a future that's really about data or data and AI and everything else. So and democracy is an older institution which doesn't have the structures necessarily to respond to the speed by which that's all happening. So you might want to think outside the box a bit and think, okay, well, what is competition policy? How does it function in relation to the vectors that control this information, rather than always trying to manage the individual, which of course is the basis of democracy. But if we move to an era where data, time, corporatism function or groups function in terms of how democracy is mediated, then we probably want to think about where our data is, really.
Yeah. All right, I'm going to ask you, Tim, for a 60-second hot take in terms of, again, keeping us on that upward trajectory of what we can do. Do you think social media platforms should have some kind of responsibility for what goes on in their spaces? Should we expect to see more intervention like we've seen recently with Donald Trump being temporarily locked out on some platforms?
Yes, here we go, 60-second hot take. Just picking up on Tom's point here. So I'm quite optimistic, I think, and I think that this is just a philosophical position that I take. But I think the state of where things are at now, we're at a point where the focus, the lens is right on platforms and the algorithms that govern how content is distributed, what ends up in people's feeds. And what we've learned from this, what is really clear now, is that they're not just ad companies, they're actually curators of, they're editors. There is a form of editorialism that happens when you have to sift through all of these posts and figure out who's going to see what. So you mentioned banning Trump. Should they allow, a hashtag like Stop the Steal to hit the #1 spot on the US trending list, right? Where people go, oh, hold on a second, maybe there is something to it. Like Colin was saying before, and they're suddenly, yeah, you know what? I've never trusted, these big vote machine manufacturers. They're in cahoots with big pharma, and the next thing it all falls apart. There's a curatorial logic. There is an editorial logic to what these platforms are doing. And I think that now the cat's out of the bag, that the president has incited violence. They've stormed the Capitol. These historic events have happened. Donald Trump has been suspended. I think now is the opportunity, I would say, it's an opportunity to enact legislation and enforceable codes of conduct that make platforms have to let lawmakers inside the black box. I think that at the moment we've got these black boxes that are protected. I'm probably beyond 60 seconds here. We're looking at them. They have this massive effect on the public sphere. They radicalize people, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I think the opportunity is to say, look, there's doors opening, or we can find a way to let lawmakers inside and really try to re-engineer these platforms so that they optimize for quality, so that they optimize for something else other than money, scale, and speed. So I'm you know, I want to end on an upbeat note. You know, I think that we can do something about this, and I agree with Tom, and I think this is a complex issue, but I do think that there are also, there's a change in the wind, and I think that we can see some new opportunities, concrete opportunities arising now.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much. There have been so many more questions that we haven't had a chance to get to. So I just want to reiterate to all the delegates that we're having our perspective sessions later in the week. So all those great questions that are coming through about libraries' roles and the role of information literacy and all of this, save those and bring them along to the perspective sessions later in the week. And also please do tweet any questions you've got to our panelists. I'm popping their Twitter handles in the chat again now. So you've got them handy. So thanks so much, Tom, Tim, and Colin for joining us today at Information Online. And for all the delegates, we're going to take a short break now, and we'll be back at 3:45 with Dr. Keir Wine-Smith. Thanks again to the panel.
Thanks. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks everyone. Thanks for the organizing. This was great.